Hello and welcome to Choose Up Fi. Today on the show, we have another episode of our book club. Today, we're reading Dollars and Cents, How We Misthink Money and How to Spend Smarter by Dan Ariely and Jeff Kreisler. This book was chock full of all of the behavioral finance and psychological aspects, these little tips on why we spend, why we think about this, some things that seem illogical, but may or may not be, frankly. And that's what's cool about money. And what we talk about here at Choose a Vi all the time is if it was just the nuts and bolts of money, this would be easy. That's 5 or 10% of it. But the other 90%, it's all about the psychological. And I have two wonderful guests here today to help me talk through this book who are uniquely suited to talk about psychology. So we have Ginger, who everyone on the podcast knows. This is her, I think, 4th appearance on the show. And Ginger is a licensed therapist. And we have Clint Murphy, and he's the host of the Growth Guide podcast. And actually, his Twitter bio says it all. I simplify psychology, success, and money by sharing advice from millionaires, expert authors, and my life. So I think we're going to have a fantastic conversation. And with that, welcome to Choose Up Fi. All right, Ginger and Clint, thank you so much for being here. Clint, welcome to Choose Up Fi.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah, man, this should be fun. So you and I talked offline about a month ago and just had a wonderful conversation. It's actually astonishing how many similarities we have in our lives, down to the accounting firm we worked for decades ago and kids the same age and all, and an interest in both Fi and psychology. So if you don't mind, just give the audience a sense of where you've been, I guess, on both of those topics, but really your interest in the Fi world in general.
Yeah, the interest in the Fi world really came out of a challenging situation where I was leaving one job. We had purchased a pre-sale townhouse that we had to close on. We hadn't sold our old townhouse. My wife was pregnant with our second child. So you added all that up. And I felt like I'd put my family in a financial situation that I never wanted to replicate. And so I decided to dive deep into FI. And when you and I talked, we both shared that at the time, this was about a decade ago, 12 years ago. So at the time, your way in was largely through Mr. Money Mustache. So I headed over to Pete's blog and I read every single blog article. You know, I started with that first one he has, and he has the next button at the bottom. Just pressed it all over the next 3 or 4 days, all the way to the hydroponics. I think that may be where I finished.
Nice. Yeah, it is amazing how that really was for our generation of Fi people, if you will. Pete's blog, that was it. I mean, that was the way in. And it's been quite a journey, especially because I started thinking about Fi before I found Pete. But that was like the aha moment for me of, oh, wow, there's some other people like me out there. There's something to this. There's some end in terms of the certainty of, hey, the shockingly simple math, right? There is actual math behind this. So yeah, just an aha moment for sure. And Ginger, so you are the person who came up with the idea for the book club here, which is awesome. So this is our second round of book club. So why do you think this particular book, Dollars and Cents, is so appropriate for the Choose a Vi community?
Well, I think one thing that's great about this book is that you always talk about actionable tips, and this one has about 64 possible actionable tips. So it explains these concepts pretty clearly that you can apply to any area of your life. But the thing that's special about this book is it's saying, okay, how are you going to apply them to your finances? So we were kind of talking before about how we were going to talk about this book when there's so much content in it. So I think what we should do is just talk about some of the concepts that we think are helpful and interesting. And then if the listeners are interested, know that this book has a lot more in it that they might connect with.
Yeah, a lot more in it. Clint, as you called it, I was dollars and dense, because it just the absolute density of how many topics are talked about here. And obviously in a 60-minute podcast, we can never go through them all. So I agree with Ginger. Let's just talk about some things that jumped out to us. So I think also the intersection of how this applies to our own lives might be especially interesting. So I suspect, like I said, personal finance is not rational all the time. It's not supposed to be. That's the thing. Like I think some people think they're doing it wrong if they're not following the exact numbers. And I've tried to dispel that so much here. Like for me, it's often what passes the sleep well at night test. And I think that's okay. Like I don't see that as being at odds with my path to Fi. I think it's my path to FI, right? And personal finance is personal.
Yeah. I love that because it makes me think about some of the things in this book really helped me to understand some of my decision-making processes. And at the same time, I'm okay with not always choosing the most logical thing. So, for example, one of the concepts I thought was really interesting was how the when of paying really influences how painful it is for us to spend money. So I'll just share something from the book. He says, if we pay for something before consuming it, the actual consumption of it feels almost painless. Paying for things while we consume them not only makes us more acutely aware of the pain of paying, but it also diminishes the pleasure of consuming. And he gives the example, the really extreme example of if you had to pay for every bite of a meal out, right? As soon as you had the bite, you had to give them 50 cents. You can see how this would really diminish the pleasure of the meal. But you can also see, I was thinking about in my own life, something like paying for an Airbnb ahead of time. So I have a couple of trips coming up this summer. I've already paid for them. It feels amazing. But I take his point, right? Like he talks about if you pay for a hotel after the trip, it feels terrible because you're paying for this thing that has already happened and it's so close to the actual consumption. And so there's a way in which if you want to spend less, you should put those things more closely together, right? Like you should increase the pain of spending by paying for that trip closer to the trip. So that's the most logical thing if you are looking to spend less money. But then that's not always my highest goal. My highest goal may be I really want to enjoy my trip and feel good about my trip. So I've paid for these a few months in advance. And maybe that means that I've spent a little bit more or am a little bit more comfortable with spending more. And to me, that's okay. Like that's a trade-off. But I also get that it's helpful to recognize that that's what's happening.
I loved how he intersected that with a way that people reduce the pain is to replace money with things like air miles or credit cards. So it reduces that pain point. And then it makes me wonder, Ginger and Brad, you see in FI when we talk about the envelope system. So we ask people, hey, take cash out every month, put it in the envelopes that you're going to spend on. Don't use the credit card. Are we almost trying to use the pain of going into that envelope to get the cash to get them to spend less?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. And yeah, this pain. Okay, are there other areas that we see that? And this whole thing is interesting, right? Because then you get into like restricted use payments, as they talked about, like gift cards. Gift cards clearly are less valuable by any definition than the equivalent amount of cash, because by its definition, you can only spend it at X location. But it's almost on some level actually a permission to spend, which if you're a certain type of person who has a difficult time spending when maybe they want to spend a little bit more, something like a gift card could actually be useful in that sense, which is funny, right? It's a paradox. And like, hey, you're getting something that is by any definition not worth as much because your optionality is less. But yet it's actually beneficial, which is super interesting.
So if you think about, for example, Starbucks, you have your Starbucks app on your phone if you use it. And a lot of people, like me, I hope, have the auto reload feature. So just auto reloads a certain amount of money because it's easier when I'm in the store just to give them my card or order through the app. And you get the stars. So you get discounts later for buying things. As you say that, though, what I realize is I'm probably much more willing to order things for me and my kids when we're on the way to school. Hey, we stop at Starbucks, grab a coffee, grab a couple sandwiches. If I was pulling cash out of my pocket, there's no way I would do that every day. There's zero chance. And there is a hack you can use with the app that maybe I'll start using again because it makes me feel better now that I realize they're using psychology against me. I'll use their tech against them.
It's so funny that you bring this up because I just had this experience yesterday with coffee where I found a new coffee shop by my office. And so I went there and they're like, oh, do you want to be a part of our club? No, absolutely not. Like, don't give me any member benefits because it's so easy to get sucked in to go, oh, well, I'm going to get this 10% discount, so that over a month's time, great, I've saved $1.80. But because it made me feel like this was such a deal and I'm getting the members deal. And, I know that I would spend way more than if I'm just paying cash and not connected to that. And we got an email from Walter who talked a little bit about the pain of paying. So I'll just read that here. He says, I was really captured by the idea of the pain of paying and its impact on our experience. Reflecting back on past experiences, it is easy to identify many instances where the pain of paying diminished the enjoyment of an experience, and likewise, paying in advance positively impacted the experience. What I got from this section of the book is that we should be a little bit more intentional about how our spending impacts our experiences. When planning for vacations or other large expenses, we should consider how the pain of paying can negatively impact our experience. But at the same time, we can also leverage the pain of paying to prevent financial mistakes or overspending.
Yeah, this pain of paying and timing of paying, right? Dylan actually wrote in with another email and said, my wife and I have always been frugal. 5 years into our marriage, we happened upon $1,500 we weren't expecting. We decided to splurge and go on a cruise. We weren't sure how we'd like all the fancy meals and indulgence. Well, turns out we loved it. I couldn't figure out what it was that made us enjoy the food so much more than normal until I read this book. Having paid for the cruise and gratuities beforehand, it felt like we were eating all week for free. It fulfilled two of our most innate desires, eating delicious food and the feeling of a good deal. I don't know how much each meal costs, and that was the point. Because we had paid for it before, there was no pain of the transaction in the moment of indulgence. One thing we do now to lessen the pain of paying for things that we truly enjoy is having our, quote, play money go into an account that isn't factored into our net worth calculation on Mint and how we calculate it. And that way we feel like it's money we already spent, and now we can enjoy whatever it is we want to enjoy. That's a really cool one. I like that, Dylan. And going back to what we were talking about with, or in passing about rewards points, I think another kind of interesting topic that they talked about in this book is opportunity cost. And I think where this ties in, I actually have an interesting little thing that I just booked. So in the old days, I would have been sheepish about this. Am I really FI if I do something like this? But the nice thing is we've dispelled that, right? Like we have tried really hard to say FI is about what you value. And I think what I'm trying to do is to spend more money, almost like the book Die with Zero that we've talked about so many times, that Ginger, that might be a future book club. But it's just such a valuable, Clint just gave a big thumbs up, which I agree with. It's such a valuable book because it makes you rethink when you spend and what you spend on. And one of the things that I'm trying to do as part of a mastermind that I'm in with Dominic Cortuccio, who's been on the show so many times, is actually try to build more fun and spontaneity into my life. I have like a very ordered life and I'm just trying to do more fun things. And part of that is also the intersection of this Die with Zero. So perfect example. And I could probably spend 10 minutes talking about this because there's also like an aspect of anchoring built into this, which we'll maybe talk about later. But in this particular case, Google, in its infinite wisdom, served me up an article about this concert that Bono, the lead singer of U2, is doing in New York City. It's a very limited time run in a small theater, like 2,500 people. It's just Bono. It's not the entire group. And it just sounded amazing. And I was like, you know what? What would it look like to do something that Brad would never do normally, which is go up to New York City and go see this concert because it's a once in a lifetime thing. I've always wanted to see Bono and U2 play, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get the chance again. So I looked into it and I actually booked this thing. So I found tickets on StubHub. They were fairly expensive, but not knock your socks off expensive. And that's actually the anchoring part, which again, I'll get to later. But I wound up using my Capital One Venture X card to pay for the flight. So I'm literally, guys, I'm flying in. This is a 24-hour trip next Wednesday. So
oh my gosh,
5 days from now, I'm leaving Wednesday morning. And this will be in the past by the time this episode comes out. But leaving Wednesday morning on a flight to New York, heading in, I got a hotel, going to see the concert that night, and I'm flying back home the next morning. And that's it. It's a 24-hour thing. Again, something I would never do. But then I'm like, okay, I can use my Venture X card to pay for the flight. And I have a travel credit. You get a $300 annual travel credit that may or may not have gone unused. Probably not. But that's $300. And then I had like $120 of rewards points left. And I use that. And where this whole story is going is I would have done it anyway, but it actually made me feel a little better that, okay, I'm being a little bit FI because I just got my whole flight for free. So now it's just the ticket and the fairly inexpensive hotel. But there obviously, by any definition, is an opportunity cost to using those points to book that flight. And I'd be lying to myself So I had this conversation with myself as I was booking. I'm like, oh, it feels great on the one hand. It's like the devil on one shoulder, the angel on the other. It's like, wow, I feel fantastic that I got this for just about nothing. But then on the other shoulder, it's like, well, dummy, you're just fooling yourself. Right. And I think because I was reading this book concurrently with this happening, like you're really just fooling yourself, but it still feels good. And I think that's the end of my my long-winded story here, is it still feels good.
Yeah. So what we're talking about now is this concept of anchoring. And they talk about in the book, an anchor price can be any figure, no matter how random, so long as we associate it with the decision. That decision gains power and influences our future decisions moving forward. Anchoring shows the importance of early decisions about pricing, that they establish a value in our heads and affect our own calculations going forward. So this is something that I think it's easy to apply to our lives as well. An example of this would be that I was at the thrift shop a couple days ago, and I was looking for exercise clothes, and I found a t-shirt and it's in great shape. Perfect. Oh my gosh, it's $5. That's so expensive. How can I possibly pay $5 for a t-shirt, right? That's because my anchor, when I'm at the Goodwill, is a lot lower about what I think something should cost. But when I pull it out of that and I say, okay, well, if I was at a different shop and this t-shirt was $5, suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an incredible deal. I need to get 10 of these. And so the anchor is it's not about the true value of it. It's the value of things around it, or it's that sort of starting point that we have.
Yeah, I think that's starting point. So I teased this a couple minutes ago about a funny story that I have with those tickets that I bought for the Bono concert. So it's actually wrapped up. So it's maybe two stories of anchoring that are all tied in this one particular example. So I have mentioned before on the podcast how my daughters and I love Taylor Swift. I guess we are Swifties. And as many people know, Taylor is on this amazing tour right now where she's doing like a 3.5 hour performance. It's like 45 songs. It's just this wild thing. And I have been looking at tickets to take me and my two daughters. So when I first went on StubHub and SeatGeek and all the other secondary places, I was absolutely flummoxed at how much these tickets are. They're like all in on the fees and stuff. Right now, they're like $1,700 for the cheapest seat, singular ticket. I kid you not, singular ticket. So I mean, we're talking like $5,000 to take the three of us to a concert, which is insane. I mean, like I can't really wrap my mind around that, or at least I couldn't. And now it's funny because every day I go back and I check on StubHub and SeatGeek, et cetera. All right, what are the tickets going to be today? And then they've actually gone up. It seems, as ludicrous as this sounds, the supply and demand has suggested that this is actually the price. This is not some anomaly. This is the price. And now they're $2,000. I'm like, oh my goodness. Like I have had the thought, I swear to you, I've had the thought, if I find tickets for $1,000 each, I would buy them in a heartbeat. What
a deal.
Right? Like I have had that thought, which is insane. If you had asked me 4 weeks ago, what is the most I would spend on a ticket? I don't know. I mean, it would have been a fraction of that, 500, which still seems ludicrous to say out loud, but it probably would have been somewhere in that vicinity. But since now my anchor is this 2,000, I would spend 1,000 in a heartbeat. And again, I probably wouldn't when it comes down to it, and we'll see. So that is such an interesting anchoring that like, even I'm susceptible, like, not that I'm some superhero, believe me, I'm as idiotic as anybody else, but I'm fully susceptible to this. And now the tie-in is, oh, now I'm thinking about $1,000 or $2,000 tickets. Now this Bono ticket seems super cheap at $250 or $300, whatever it is. That's a bargain.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of anchoring.
Right? And like just to see that in my life, the week that I'm reading this book was pretty wild.
Yeah. Maybe this would be a good time for us to define a little bit opportunity cost. So here's the idea of opportunity cost, that every now and then you take money out of the equation. So when you're thinking about, maybe I'm going to buy this sweater, it's $100. Well, another way to think about that is that's 30 coffees, right? And so taking money out, because money, there's this way that it's really hard to understand its value, but to say, oh, this means that I won't be able to have this coffee for the next 6 months. And so the example that they gave that I thought was really interesting was about a slightly bigger house or a smaller house and an extra vacation every year, tuition for your children's college, and new furniture for the house. And when you think about it that way, it really changes the equation, or the equation really feels differently if you just take money out and you substitute it with other things.
Because Brad threw out die with zero, the one ginger that Bill Perkins did was break everything down into how many hours would I have to work to buy that.
Yep, exactly.
When you do that one, it really shifts the game for understanding value. And then you can decide whether you're going to spend less on things because you don't want to give up that time, or you're just going to increase your hourly earnings to make it so that it takes less time to earn those things that you do want to buy. I find that absolutely a fascinating way to look at it.
And actually, yeah, there is an interesting thing, just going back to what you were saying, Ginger, about opportunity cost. There was a study, actually, this is old school, buying these stereo systems. So opportunity cost neglect was the name of the paper. And in their experiment, one group of participants was asked to decide between a $1,000 Pioneer stereo and a $700 Sony stereo. The second group was asked to pick between the $1,000 Pioneer and a package deal where for $1,000 they could get the Sony plus $300 to be spent on CDs. So again, kind of old school. In reality, both groups were choosing between different ways of spending that $1,000. The first group chose between spending all of it on a Pioneer or spending $700 on a Sony and $300 on other things, essentially anything else, right? Because they hadn't spent the money. The second group chose between spending all of it on a Pioneer or spending $700 on a Sony and $300 on music. The results showed that the Sony stereo was a much more popular choice when it was accompanied by $300 of CDs than when it was sold without them. Why is this odd? Well, strictly speaking, an unconstrained $300 is worth more than $300 that must be spent on CDs. This is what I was talking about before, because we can buy anything with the unconstrained money, including CDs. But when the $300 was framed as being dedicated to CDs, the participants found it much more appealing. That's because $300 worth of CDs is much more concrete and defined than just $300 of anything. So I thought that was cool. That one jumped out to me. And yeah, it's especially interesting here. But Clint, how do you think in terms of opportunity cost? Because I think we're kind of limiting here, but how would you describe opportunity cost just in life as opposed to like this very concrete way we're talking about it here?
So what I love to do is look at how do we talk about money and then how do we take it out of money? So if we go to psychology, this is the one that we always write about where we say, if I say yes to something, what am I saying no to? And that's the opportunity cost of our time. Because if I say yes to going to that concert with you next Wednesday, if I say that's a great idea, I'm going to book a flight and fly with you to New York, then I'm maybe missing my son's basketball game that night. And so what are those things we're saying yes to? How much time do they consume and when do they consume the time versus what could we be doing in their place?
Yeah. When you're making a decision, what are you giving up? And in most cases, you're giving up every other possible choice that you could have made, right?
Yes, it's so vast because there's so many other things. You can't even comprehend what those things are when you say yes. And if we tie that, oh my gosh, if we tie that into pain of paying, this is why when an event is so far away on our calendar and someone sends an invite, we say yes. And then as it gets closer to the event, the pain of having said that yes escalates to the point where you're hoping that person calls and cancels because now you realize, wow, that's actually going to consume a lot of my time at a point in time where I need it for other things. And I hadn't contemplated far enough ahead in advance.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, it's like the current self and future self. And that also ties back into money in so many ways in terms of saving money, thinking about the long term, right? But yeah, Clint, I hear you. I think one of the things I'm trying to work on in life is saying no to things because that future self of mine, like everything sounds good in the moment. Like, of course you want to say yes. I mean, I'm a kind of a people pleaser as it is. So almost invariably, my first thought is to say yes. But then I know now, because I've been through it so many times, that my future self is going to be the morning of when I look at that calendar or the day before and I see something on there that sounded great 6 months ago. Well, damn, now I actually have to do that. And it's frustrating. And like you said, you don't want to get in a situation where like you're grumbling about talking to somebody or doing something that ostensibly is fun or whatever. But it gets to a point of, and I know I'm kind of rambling here, but there is that weird intersection between current self and future self.
Well, and it's the same concept because it's saying that the pain point, because it's so far away, we're willing to do the painful part, I'm using air quotes here, like make the commitment, right? Put in my credit card because it's so far, it's so disconnected from the actual event.
Yeah. And I like what you said before, Ginger, and I want to make sure everybody heard it. So, right, you're either increasing or decreasing the pain that goes along with this spending, right? So if your goal, and it's not to say one is laudable and one isn't, right? Like there's not a right answer because it's situational and it's situational in your life. Like if you're looking to have a guilt-free vacation where you don't worry about the stress of paying, then pay far in advance, it sounds like. Whereas if you are looking to potentially spend less just in general, you want to keep that payment point as close to or maybe after is ultimately what I'm hearing you say, right?
Right.
The other fun one for us to share with the listeners as we go through these sometimes is the book's written in a way where it's, hey, be aware of these things so you reduce your spending so that you make less financial mistakes. Where it can often be fun if you're running a business or you have products or you have services is how do I use these psychological failing points to sell whatever it is I'm selling, to get more podcast listeners, to sell more digital products, to have more people come to my coffee shop. So the one thing that the listeners probably ought to be aware of is most of these large corporations have entire teams dedicated to reading books like this, hiring psychologists like this to tell them what are the psychological flaws that I can take advantage of in my copywriting, campaigns, advertising, etc.
Yeah, exactly. The coffee club is not there for me.
Yes.
The consumer, right?
Exactly.
And there's a great example in the book about this in particular, especially for anybody who has a business or an online business specifically, maybe where you sell courses or sell something like that. So Dan Ariely talked about this in his prior book, Predictably Irrational, which is fantastic. And they were talking about subscriptions to The Economist to illustrate this problem. So in this case, they could get an online subscription for $59, a print subscription for $125, or a print and online subscription for that same $125. So in this scenario, 84% of the people chose the print and the web because it sounds like a great deal, right? You're getting this for free. And the 16% would choose the web only, and none chose the $125 print only, which makes sense, right? Why would you choose that? But then what if our choice was just between the $59 web only offer and the $125 print and web option? So suddenly 68% would choose web only, up from 16%, while only 32% would go for the $125 print and web option, down from 84%. So just by including this clearly inferior print-only option, which nobody chose, it literally was just there as a lark, more or less, The Economist nearly tripled the sales of its $125 web and print version. Why? Because that print-only option was a decoy employing relativity to push us towards the combo deal. Yeah, this is wild. Clint, I know for people who have had online businesses for a while, that 3 options,
Yes.
This is something we talk about a lot, right?
Yeah. I've heard, and we'd have to fact check this, but even if you go to a restaurant and you're looking at the wine list, people think, oh, the expensive wines, that's where they really get you. And you've got these low price ones, but I don't want those ones. Apparently, the ones that have the highest margin for the restaurant are the mid-priced wines. So you look at the high ones, you think, well, I don't want to spend that much money, so maybe I'll have a glass of this. But that one in the middle is the one that has the highest margin. And so they've decoyed you down from the top, up from the bottom, into the exact one they want you to drink that has the highest margin for them.
Right. And so the important point here is not just that it's the middle, but because the middle is the powerful place, that means that the range can change. So it can be between $5 and $15, and then that $10 one is going to be the most appealing. But using that concept, you move it up and you say, okay, actually, the lowest end is going to be $10 and the highest end is going to be $20. So now the middle's 15, and that's the one that everyone's going to choose.
So that middle option, there's a quote that I had highlighted. The cheapest and most expensive items are road signs funneling us to the middle option. And I guess it's because we don't have a sense of like an absolute value for things. It seems like everything is relative based on what's around us. I always like to say, like, humans are not absolute animals. We are relative animals of the people that live around us or what we see. And I know this was in the book. I don't have a quote on it, but it's that old thing of, hey, would you rather make $150,000 when everybody around you is making 300,000, or would you rather make 80,000 when everybody around you is making 50,000? And it's crazy that most people, because we are not absolute animals, we're relative animals, most people would pick option B, at least in these studies. So it's super interesting how our brains work.
All right, team. The principle that really jumped out at me on this one was the principle of fairness. And I'll give the example that he gives and then tie it back to even this conversation that we have today. And the idea is that the principle of fairness changes our perception of value. If someone provides a service quickly, we're less likely to value it, even if the reason they provided it quickly was because of their experience. So let's take an example, and many people may have heard this one. It's a Picasso story. And a woman happens to see him in a coffee shop doing his drawings and asks him to do a sketch of her. He looks at her, and within seconds, he draws a couple lines, and she says, "You perfectly captured my essence. How much do I owe you?" And when he says 5,000, she says, "But it only took you 2 seconds." And he says, "No, it took me an entire life and a few more seconds." And so when I think about that one, it talks about, if we think about our lives, how do we overcome this issue if we're trying to get paid for our value? And it talks about increasing transparency. So I look at how we're recording this conversation, and I think about how I record, and the level of thought and spacing and pausing to get the exact product you want, that's only visible because I'm behind the scenes. To the listener, they may just hear a great finished product, and they have no idea of the effort because they don't have the transparency into your recording process of how much work you actually put into it to get that good end product.
So here's how they describe it. They say, we implicitly assume that something labor intensive is worth more than something that isn't. And I loved the example they gave of the locksmith and how someone who's really efficient and really good at their job might come and solve your lock problem in 3 seconds. And then we have feelings about it. Like, how can this possibly cost $50? It only took you a few seconds, right? Same scenario as the one Clint just described. And so that there's something funny about how if someone comes and really struggles and, oh, I need to get a different tool, and, oh, I'm jingling around with the lock for a while, right? Then that person we're happier to pay a higher price for because we see the effort, even though in this example, the effort is fake, right? And so that's sort of interesting to think of on both ends, to think of as the consumer and how it is that we value others' experience or expertise. And then it's also interesting on the other end of that, which is where should we highlight our effort in a way to make our value apparent.
Yeah, I loved that one about the locksmith. I was going to read that story, but here's another scenario. Ever had a stubborn car problem and the mechanic fixes it in a few minutes with one simple tool and turns around and tells us that it'll cost $80? Most people get angry in that circumstance. Now consider if it had taken 3 hours and cost $120. Would that seem more justified? What if it took 4 days and cost $225? Isn't the problem fixed either way and at a fraction of the time and cost in the first scenario? But if you're honest with yourself, right? Like, you think about that, you would be kind of ticked off, which is ludicrous. But again, that's what we're highlighting here is we are not rational beings. We just aren't. But yeah, if you thought that they were laboring over this and it took 4 days and cost $225, well, okay, that sounds more fair. But right, how silly is that when what you're actually paying for, and I think this is my big takeaway, is like, you're paying for the job to be completed. You're paying for, really, put another way, probably more succinctly, is you're looking for that problem to be solved.
Yes.
Right? Like, why should you care? You're paying for an expert to solve a problem for you. I go back to, and I don't know where I had this kind of thought process at like 13 years old, but I still remember this vividly. This is one of those like formative moments in my brain, as weird as this is. Like, a buddy of mine used to mow lawns, and he mowed the lawn of his neighbor. And this woman would only pay him per hour of work. It wasn't I'm going to pay you X number of dollars to finish the job. So what's his incentive? His incentive is to go as slowly as possible, to look like he's laboring and to earn as much money, which that's a slightly different nuance. But really, that woman was paying for her lawn to be mowed and the edges trimmed at its essence. And that should be a job. You should not be penalized. And this is why this was this formative thing for me, is like, I always saw it as he was being penalized for being efficient and being good at his job. And that makes no sense. It was wholly illogical to me then, and it's wholly illogical to me now, which is why the Picasso thing is so beautiful. The locksmith thing. I mean, this is what it is. You're paying for someone's skill, and you shouldn't penalize them for actually being good at their job because they're solving the problem that you need solved.
Yeah, this section really inspired me to be a better ginger. Like, I really want to be the person who, when the locksmith comes now, says, "Oh my gosh, thank you for being so efficient."
Exactly.
The other thing that they talked about was, well, how do we get across that level of effort if we're not visible, if we're not manual laborers? And so you see the rise in what they call effort language or effort terms: artisanal, handcrafted, fair trade, organic. So we hear these and we think, well, wow, that must have taken much more effort. I should be willing to pay that extra 20% for their product. And so do we just discard those? Do we just discard whenever we see those big, bold words on the packaging because we know they're trying to sell us on effort?
Well, yeah, I wonder, does that get into something else, right? Like, does that kind of language then become meaningless BS in essence, right? Like, if you see it too often, does it become less meaningful also? Do you think that it's just salesmanship?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. And that's unfair in a lot of senses if it truly is those things, right? Because then these words become meaningless. They become buzzwords when they actually had some meaning at the beginning. And I suspect, yeah, it's so interesting how all this stuff works. Like, I think that's my takeaway from everything is this is so interesting.
It becomes like an arms race of terms. So now fair trade isn't good enough. So we see that it's organic and fair trade artisanal coffee. So we've just got to keep upping the other packaging to make ours stand out.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I wonder, another thing that's always gotten me, they talk about consumption vocabulary. And one that I've always been intrigued by is wine and how few people can actually discern the difference between good wine and bad wine. Like, they're just vanishingly few people that can truly tell the difference. But how do we know the difference between quote unquote good wine and not so good wine? Based on the price, right? That's the proxy for a lot of people. And I think that's the proxy for good and bad in a lot of senses. And they said here, quote, Dan used a simple heuristic: expensive must mean good. So in this case, he got the expensive couch. And it's like, wow, how many of us are tricked into that simple heuristic of expensive equals good?
And the one that jumps out at me that combines those that you both may see if you're fans of sushi is how sushi's evolved over the last, let's say, 20 years. You know, you used to go and you get your California roll, Negatoro roll, dynamite roll, very basic things, spicy salmon, spicy tuna. Now it's like in the book, they talk about the slippery eel roll, and it's got all, instead of just saying eel, rice, seaweed, it's an entire paragraph of description of what makes this roll. And instead of being $2.99, it's a $14.99 roll. And is it really 6x the value of what you previously were going to buy?
So one of the other concepts we have to talk about is sunk cost, because that's a really powerful one. And sunk cost is where once we've invested in something, we have a hard time giving up on that investment. And so they talk about that the solution is we shouldn't think about how much we have already invested in a job, a career, a relationship, a home, or a stock. We should focus on how likely it is to be valuable in the future. And we got a great email that linked directly to this, so I'm going to read that. This is from Joanna. She said, I decided to give up my kiteboarding equipment worth $2,000 to a friend who lives within walking distance of a beach. In contrast, I currently live in Colorado and nowhere near a significant body of water. I bought the kiteboarding equipment several years ago when I lived on the Gulf Coast and took a bunch of lessons which were not cheap. However, the sport just never clicked despite my best efforts. I have felt so guilty about quitting due to the significant sunk cost of both time and energy, But finally, I'm choosing to focus on the joy I experienced from the challenge of trying to learn a new sport, the opportunity to meet some great people during the lessons, and the adventures on the water in beautiful places all over the world. Thank you for this challenge.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. And I think sunk costs, that's one of the things that we fall prey to the most, I suspect. This is something that is universal, and it's hard. When you've devoted time and resources to something, you factor it in. It's still there. But the argument usually is, okay, what if you were starting today? What would you do? What choice would you make, irrespective of those sunk costs? Because again, using this, hey, you have amnesia, you have no sense of how much money or time or whatever. What is the right decision today? And that is really difficult to do mentally, but it's critical. That is, to me, that's the link, is I'm breaking my own susceptibility to sunk cost fallacy and just looking at this and saying, okay, what is the right decision today based on the facts on the ground as I see them right at this moment? Because things change. Like, I think a lot of us look back not only on the sunk cost, but hey, I made this great decision and you have to see it through. But the fact of the matter is, it's okay to change your mind. Facts change all the time. We need to update our thinking. This is critical to success in life. You need to update your thinking when facts change. And I think there's a perfect example in the book here. They're talking about, I guess, a fictional car company ultimately, which is, what if we were the CEO of a car company and we have a plan for a new car that will cost $100 million to develop? We've already invested $90 million of that $100 million needed. And all of a sudden we learn that our competitor is nearly finished with a car that's greener, more efficient, and more affordable. The question is, do we abandon our plan and save the last $10 million? Or do we spend that last $10 million hoping that someone will buy our cars despite their inferiority? And I think just stopping there, because it goes on, I think a lot of people would spend that last 10 million because you're so close to the finish line, right? Like, I've already put in 90, we're almost there. And then we have something to show for this, as opposed to, what if we abandon it? If we stopped right now, we have literally nothing to show for that 90 million. But what's actually the right decision? I think they illustrate that with, now imagine the same situation, only this time we haven't invested the first dollar and the total expected cost of development is just 10 million. Just as we start really working on the project, we hear that the competitor has designed a better car than ours. Do we invest the $10 million now? At this decision point, the question of whether to invest $10 million or not, these two cases are exactly the same. However, in the first case, it's difficult not to look backward to see the 90 million we've already spent, right? But now in this second case, you've spent nothing. There's no sunk cost. If you were producing something clearly inferior and you hadn't started yet, would you start? I think probably 99% of people would not start in that case. But I wonder what percent of people would keep going in that exact same scenario, right? Where there's still $10 million to spend. So obviously that's an extreme example. Very few of us are going to be CEOs of car companies. But I think sunk costs and sunk cost fallacy, this is something that you will see impacted in your life at some point. And you probably have seen it many, many times. So this is a very important takeaway.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you hit on how difficult the sunk cost bit is, because we talk about some of these other ones like, oh, if you're paying in cash or credit card, or, oh, thinking about the timing and, where to increase your pain point. And those things are pretty easy. And when you think about sunk cost, oh, your heart just hurts, right? Like, oh, I spent all this time or I spent all this money on this equipment. And so this is one that's really good to understand, because when you hit it, it's really hard.
This is also one of those ones where we say, well, let's take it away from money and let's apply it to life. And Brad, you were hinting at it a little, and I looked up one of my favorite quotes from John Maynard Keynes while you were both talking, and it is, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And when you think about that, so often in life, new information comes out every day, and yet we hold on doggedly to our beliefs, habits, mindsets. How much effort do we spend questioning, do I still hold the right beliefs? Do I have the right mindsets? And if I want to achieve a level of success I haven't achieved yet, what do I need to give up, even though I've invested the last 44 years of my life in it? Because it's probably not serving me. And so you can take that concept of money and you can apply it to your entire life. And the best spot we see this is politics, where people think there's a dividing line in every issue. I'm on this side of the line, so I have to be on this side of the line for every issue. Well, no, that's a big sunk cost fallacy. You can be anywhere on a spectrum at any point in time, but you've invested so much of yourself to being blue or to being red. And now everything you do has to be that way. That's where I see sunk cost fallacy at its worst, is in politics.
Yeah. And that's also the tie of identity and how you think, hey, I'm lining up on this team and I'm not thinking. And it's funny because when you were talking about that Keynes quote, I immediately thought of politics actually, and that phrase that people get attacked with is being a flip-flopper.
Yes.
Right?
And, exactly.
And of course, we're not a political show here. We're just talking about this because it's interesting and the psychological aspects. Like flip-flopper is used as this cudgel to attack somebody, when I view the world as the opposite, which is if you are just dogmatically the same and you never change your mind when facts change, I think that's the worst mentality you could possibly have in life. Flip-flopper obviously is a wonderful phrase of attack, but really the mindset I think is actually a good one in that, hey, of course I've changed my mind. If I haven't changed my mind since I was 17 years old on a topic, I mean, that's probably pretty odd. And I think I change my mind all the time. And I view that as a source of growth, not as something wrong with me or that I don't even know. I can't think of even a way to soften that. Like that is just simply a source of growth, and the world changes all the time.
So another one that jumped out at me in the book that can get us in trouble is this idea that we overvalue what we already have, whether that's our objects, items, or even, for example, our home. And they call that the endowment effect, which indicates the current owner of an item overvalues it, and therefore they'll want to sell it for a higher price than someone is willing to pay for it. And the example that they give of this in the book is a couple who want to sell a home that they bought, let's say, 20 years ago for $50,000. And now its value is somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000 based off transactions that have been happening around them lately. And so for any of us, that would be a massive win. But the market has shifted, and the house may only be worth $750,000 today. But because it's their home and they've seen, tying to relativity, they've seen trades in the area at higher numbers, they aren't willing to let it go for where market is today because it's their home. So it has to get that high price that the past trades got, even if that's not where the market is today.
Right. And another aspect of endowment effect that I thought was interesting was building essentially extraneous items that maybe were of value to you or sentimental value to you into why this house should be worth something. And again, we're picking on the house, but this was such a great example of like, oh, that's where little Jimmy took his first steps, something like that. Or in this case, they're talking about a chandelier, some ridiculous, like, I think it was a bike rack chandelier or something that objectively anybody else is going to look at and say, wow, that's ridiculous. Why is that there? Like maybe your real estate agent should have staged the place a little better. But to you, that brings up memories of X, Y, and Z. And of course, in your mind, that has value. But really, it goes back to maybe something we were talking about before, which is it's like a sunk cost on some level, right? Like this tie-in of, hey, that is looking at something that is irrelevant to the current decision-making process, which in this case, it doesn't matter what the sentiment was in that. It doesn't matter that you own it. It's not worth anymore. It's worth what someone else is willing to pay for it. That is the definition of a market. And I think when we build a lot of these other extraneous things into a decision-making process, that's where it gets clouded. And I think to me, that's one of the big takeaways of the book just generally is you need to look at the facts on the ground today and not get caught up in these mental fallacies in a sense, and just look at what's the reality if I could essentially be someone else looking in on this situation. And that's maybe a step to possibly combat this is, okay, put yourself in someone else's shoes, which is difficult, frankly, but that might be a way, like the Viktor Frankl, like the space between stimulus and response, right? Like this could be an example of how to build that space in of put yourself in someone else's shoes. Is this worth more, less, or the same. And very rarely is it going to be worth more in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes that you just mentioned right there from Viktor Frankl. In everything I've done over the last dozen years or so, whether it's FI or improving your life, has been increasing the gap between stimulus and response, because that's where we get to make the good decisions.
Yeah. And I know this is something I'm working on. I think all of us should be working on this, like that instant quick hit response. And for me, one of my kind of weird triggers is like, it's some kind of like anxiety or not feeling safe in situation. Like I respond with like a little bit of frustration and anger. Like that's my like initial quick hit response sometimes. And I'm just trying to say like, that is not serving me. Like, why do I do that? I don't know why. Like I haven't put enough time and effort into figuring out the root cause, but I know that's my response sometimes. Or like if I hear a loud noise or something, like I instantly, and 99 times out of 100, a loud noise is not any issue. Just take a breath, man. Like I think that's what I'm telling myself. It's like, just take a breath. You don't need to be on high alert all the time. And I think, obviously that's a little insight into my own issues, but I'm on high alert often. And I think that's one thing I'm trying to get better at. And I think that's what's cool about a lot of the stuff we talked about here is like, okay, I clearly just made this psychological in my life, but the same principle works with money. The same principle works with decision making. And that's the beauty of a book like this, and certainly what Viktor Frankl was talking about.
And here you're talking so much about intention. And I think that can lead us nicely into what the authors were talking about, how things end colors our entire experience of that thing. And so they're talking about it in terms of getting the most out of your money, getting the most out of your experiences. It made me think of something we've talked about, thinking about your memories as dividends. And if you really think about your experiences as investments, then thinking about how they end can be really important. So one example they give is they say, okay, at the end of your vacation, you should really think about the closing. Like, is the last thing going to be the terrible trip home where your flight was canceled and the plane ride was horrible, right? That's going to influence how you think about the entire trip. But instead, if you end the vacation the night before in your hotel room and you sort of toast to the great adventure that you've had, that makes that experience a better experience. Brad, I know that you just got back from a vacation recently. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking about, vacations in my own life. And I wonder, what was the end of your vacation like?
Yeah, that's a really good one. What's funny, as you were saying that, it reminded me of another cognitive bias that I just quickly Googled and luckily found in 10 seconds. So, and it ties into your question also, which is awesome. So it's the peak end rule. So this is a cognitive bias that impacts how people remember past events. Intense positive or negative moments, the peaks, and the final moments of an experience, the end, are heavily weighted in our mental calculus. So peak end rule. This is something that's really important. Now, what's funny, and my particular example, so we went to the Atlantis down in the Bahamas, and the end of our vacation was not fantastic. So the last day was basically 12 hours of travel. Our final flight almost essentially got canceled because some person like almost got arrested on the airplane because he like forcibly made his way. It was crazy, like absolutely wild. What time? It was very memorable. No, it was certainly memorable, which is awesome. It was just wild that it happened. It was one of those things you would have seen like on the news essentially. And like we came within 2 minutes of this. Luckily, this person escorted himself off the flight before they had to get the authorities involved, which we all would have had to deplane. So anyway, our flight almost got canceled. It was wild. So that was a 12-hour thing. So the end was not great, but the peaks were so great on the actual vacation that in my mind, it kind of overrode the negativity of the end, which is pretty cool. So the thing that we did, and I think, Ginger, we talked about this on our last roundup, was we did like a swimming with dolphins experience, which the four of us, my family of four, did this swimming with dolphins thing at the Atlantis. And it was just awesome. It was something we'll remember forever. Like, I still can't believe I did that. It was so far, like, I'm a good swimmer, but it was very far outside of my comfort zone. That was a peak. They have these water slides there that I did with my girls, and it was just super fun. So the peaks were fantastic. And the end was not great, but still in my mind's eye, it was a very positive experience. So that might be interesting as we all think back on vacations of like that peak end, which supersedes the other potentially. I mean, hopefully they're both good, but in my case, one clearly was good and one clearly was not.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's helpful about knowing the end thing is that that's something you could potentially have some control over. And so even if the flight is terrible, it's, oh, let's go out to eat, even though we're home, right? To make something else the end.
And that's a brilliant point. So, right, obviously, my stupid story notwithstanding, which is, kind of a silly tangent, but that's what we're looking for here, right? And that's why we just spent an hour with this episode is, okay, are there ways that we can combat this? And I think that's one cool thing is, hey, vacation is not going to be unicorns and rainbows 24 hours a day. It just isn't. Like I could look back on our vacation at the Atlantis in this wonderful spot in the Bahamas and say, all right, there were aspects of it that were pretty boring, right? You're just sitting around and, just lounging by the pool. It's fine for what it is. But those peaks were great. And then, yeah, Ginger, in that case, like, hey, maybe the next time we all go on vacations, we think about, okay, we know that we're going to remember the peaks and the end. So what do you do to make them, especially the end, a little bit better? Because there's already some opposing forces in that the end, almost by its very definition, is a laborious day of travel. So how do you make it a little more fun, a little more interesting, a little more memorable?
So listeners, if you do this in the future, call in and tell us about it and we'll include it in the roundup.
Yeah, and it makes me think, do you tack on 2 extra days at home so that when you get back, you have a massage booked, you have a spa booked, something where you're able to take away from the pain of that travel day? So now you're ending on, hey, I got home, I had some meditation time, I had some spa time, I had a massage, and I'm going back to work relaxed, not stressed from the flight.
Yeah, that's cool. Right. Especially for people who try to maximize every minute of vacation. Well, maybe you rethink that, right? Of coming back from the trip doesn't have to end at Sunday at 10 p.m. It might actually be a better experience in that scenario of, hey, we came back on a Friday and then I had these 2 days of downtime where I have these other fun things planned, as opposed to it was stress at the very end. And oh no, I've got to wake up tomorrow at 6 a.m. and go to work. So yeah, that's a cool takeaway, Clint. I like that.
And book it and pay for it in advance so you don't have the pain of paying.
Nice. Yeah, Clint, that I like it. And this is fun. This is what it's all about. All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close here. This was a lot of fun. It's a tall task, obviously, to try to summarize a book in an hour podcast episode. But I think hopefully we did a good job of passing along the important lessons, and most especially how you, the listener, can really apply this to your life in so many situations. I think that's what's cool about books like this. And this is one of dozens of books in this genre. Every time I read one of these, I find a couple of those little nuggets that I'm just either astounded by or then astounded by and take into my own life. And yeah, Ginger, as promised, even though I said maybe this is the last book club ever, I think we're going to do another one. This is a lot of fun. And Ginger, people obviously can find you here at Choosify. You're becoming a regular co-host, which is a lot of fun. You also have a website, speaking of fun, called phiisfun.com. And Clint Murphy, I mentioned at the top, you have a podcast called The Growth Guide. And you are also one of the most prolific people on Twitter. You're one of my absolute favorite follows. I think you have 300,000+ followers on Twitter, which is astonishing, but it's not that astonishing when you see the quality of what you're posting there every day. So thank you, my friend. And people can find you at I am Clint Murphy. To the audience, thank you for sending in your emails. We got some voicemails also. We didn't have a chance to play on the podcast here, but we always appreciate this. This is, as we say, a crowdsourced personal finance show, and we greatly appreciate you being involved.